You're watching World Talks on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. It's been a big year for NATO, from Mark Rutte stepping up to Jens Stoltenberg stepping down as Secretary-General, to Sweden and Finland being fast-tracked into membership, and more countries finally forking out the 2% GDP spend on defence. NATO has also flexed its muscle by increasing military exercises on its eastern flank and in the Baltic Sea. So, is the alliance a sleeping giant that is now reawakened? Here to discuss more is Eoin McNamara, Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you for your time on New Year's Eve.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
First of all, Mr. McNamara, I want to ask you, how crucial is NATO to enduring peace in Ukraine, especially as we head into 2025?
Well, NATO is very crucial to ensuring peace in Ukraine. NATO members, either bilaterally or through different contact groups, the Ramstein group, are very are vital to supplying Ukraine with the military aid it requires, and also the logistics to get that military aid to Ukraine. It requires to keep the Ukrainian military on the battlefield, to keep the Ukrainian military competitive, and to ensure that Ukraine is not in a position at some point in the future to negotiate a peace, an unjust peace based on Russia and Vladimir Putin's terms, seeking to assert a sphere of influence in Europe, or reassert the Russian sphere of influence in Europe, which nobody on NATO's eastern flank and NATO as a whole wants or requires.
We've now seen NATO announcing that it will enhance military presence in the Baltic Sea. That comes at the same time that Estonia launches that naval operation to protect the undersea power cable connected to Finland. Do you feel like NATO needs to better take into account its response and strategy, especially around hybrid warfare?
Well, NATO has been doing an awful lot to counter hybrid warfare, and there's been a lot over the past decade now, since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014. NATO, its international staff, NATO member states have been adapting their strategic IQ to counter all manner of hybrid threats. And we just don't really know when a certain hybrid threat can get through. The arena for causing hybrid interference is very broad. Some threats will always get through. The most important thing is, in this regard, is our resilience, our ability to get back up, fix what sabotaged, not accept information warfare, repel cyber aggression, all these different cyber attacks that happen kinetically and in the information and cyber domain. Our resilience to get up and not let the Russians put us off our game, so to say, disrupt our societies. To say, that these threats will not be successful. You can try them. We've got it covered. And continuing with this sort of behavior is futile. And I think NATO has made many strides, and not just NATO, the societies within NATO member states have made many leaps and bounds in that, or on that course, over the past decade.
Looking at these Baltic Sea incidents, and we've seen a number of them now, if they're found to have been clear sabotage, or if any of them are found to have been clear sabotage, does that give NATO grounds to invoke Article 5, this idea that an attack on one is an attack on all? Do you think it would do that?
Well, we also need, we need to think of escalation. What is worth our while? Is it worth going up the chain of escalation for a damaged electricity wire? I think not. What the Russians are really trying to do here, if it was them or those their proxies, so to say, their shadow fleet, they're trying to stretch the alliance's resources, and they're trying to move the focus away from Ukraine and NATO's efforts to support Ukraine and to indeed secure its eastern flank. So rather than talk about Article 4, which is the consultative article in the North Atlantic Treaty, and indeed beyond that, Article 5, an attack on one, an attack on all, I think it makes more sense to talk about resources, to have resources to be able for NATO to respond in different vectors across the alliance, maintaining resources so that NATO can operate in different contexts across the alliance is vital. And I think to counter Russian hybrid aggression, more of the focus needs to be on that. Both the discussion, our discourses like this, but also the policy focus of NATO member states and the NATO institutions as a whole.
And when we talk about resources, NATO defence contributions are critical. Do the likes of President-elect Donald Trump have a point when they suggest there has been too much reliance on the US?
There has been, particularly before 2014. But I think, when Donald Trump was there the last time between 2017 and 2021, he administered some great shocks to the European psyche in this regard, and we've seen spending pick up, and we've seen countries on the eastern flank. We've seen Poland, indeed, and the Baltic states really lead by example in this regard. They're close to the threat, and they're willing to put their money where their mouth is, so to say. And it's not just been eastern flank states; it's been many other European states as well. Not all. There is room to improve, and there is room to invest more, even though the economic picture in Europe right now is somewhat disappointing. So we need to also think of the economic dimension, how we grow our economies. But it's not just about cash. It's about, you can't throw zlotys or you can't throw euros or dollars at a tank and hope it will stop. It's about making sure we get a good bang for our buck, making sure that this defense investment now that we're making in Europe and we're making across the alliance, making sure that converts into real defense capabilities so we can strengthen our deterrence. That's really the order of the day right now.
Should Europe be worried about the potential of the US pulling out of NATO, Donald Trump's threats, and I guess, can Europe defend itself alone?
I think the possibility of Donald Trump withdrawing from NATO is very, very remote. And of course, I think the United States have firewalled its political system from that. You now need a 2/3 majority in the Congress, I believe. Or if not the Senate, I'd need to double check that. But either the Congress as a whole or the Senate to withdraw from a treaty like the North Atlantic Treaty. Of course, in the current political climate in the United States, no president, Donald Trump or anyone else, is unlikely to get that 2/3. So Trump, I don't think withdrawing from NATO is on the cards. He can, in different ways, if he gets annoyed or angered with European allies, paralyze NATO in a way, because of course it's the president of the United States that is responsible for troop movement, say. If the president says yes, the troops move, and the plan is formed by the Pentagon and the different commands in the United States. But if the president says no, the troops don't move. So the measure of force that the United States can exert, that still rests in the hand of the president. But of course, some people are very pessimistic about Donald Trump. Some people are more optimistic. I think there is room. I still have faith in transatlantic diplomacy, that we can talk Trump round and that we can convince him of the value of NATO, not just for Europe and European defense, but the value of NATO for the United States and the value of the transatlantic link for the United States and for Europe as well. Not just strategically or in security terms, but also for our societies, our democracies, and our economies.
I'm interested as well in what you make of the accession of Ukraine into NATO. Does peace have to happen first before these talks can tangibly take place, or do you expect, perhaps a delay in that accession could be part of the negotiations to bring peace?
Depends on the type of peace. There are many different forms of peace, and whether Ukraine's security arrangements at a particular time can facilitate some sort of compromise that can bring the country into NATO. But make no bones about it, if we are to have lasting peace in Europe, Ukraine will need security guarantees from the Western powers in one form or another. And I think the most steadfast way of doing that is bringing Ukraine into NATO. If not, we'll have a geopolitically uncertain Ukraine, a Ukraine that might look attractive again for someone like Vladimir Putin if he's still around, or another nationalist, revanchist leader in the Kremlin, and might tempt another attack in 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years from now if Ukraine's security is not locked down. And obviously that's a big problem for Ukraine and a big worry lingering over its society that will stunt its development, that will stunt its growth. But it's also a big problem for all of us in Europe, because we will have this essentially this abscess or this bleeding wound or this powder keg, depending the metaphor you want to use, of this threat lingering over Ukraine, lingering over us all in Europe into the future. And this is not the vision we want for a safe, secure, and prosperous Europe. So we must make the sacrifices of doing all that we can so that Ukraine gets these hard security guarantees to guarantee peace in Ukraine into the future when this horrible war reaches its conclusion.
Given the importance of that enduring peace, why do you feel like countries like Germany remain resistant to Ukraine's entry to the alliance?
I think when we look at Berlin, I think they've been swallowing too much of the Russian narrative. If I'm quite honest about it, that Russia will say, "Oh, if you extend NATO, this will be the same old." The Poles and the Baltic states have known it for many years. If you extend NATO membership will be aggressive. It'll alienate Russia, and Russia will strike back. Of course, Russia's escalation in 2022 in Ukraine had nothing to do with NATO membership. NATO is a very defensive alliance that has stabilized. We see the countries just to the west of Ukraine. NATO membership has stabilized those countries and has allowed, once those countries, Baltic states, Poland, many tragic years, say in the 1930s, before that, between two empires, between Germany, the German Empire, and the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, whichever period you want to look at, tragic periods without strong security guarantees, and tragedy ensued. But of course, when the security was locked down in Poland, when it was locked down in the Baltic states, we've seen great prosperity and great flourishing of these societies in the Baltic states. Where I live in Finland now. I lived in the Baltic states for many years. I'm a regular visitor to Poland. I've seen these societies flourish, and they flourish because there's a strong baseline security provided by NATO security guarantees, and we want that for Ukraine as well. It's vital if we're going to rebuild Ukraine in a prosperous manner. And I think rather than the security guarantee itself, rather than that baseline itself, it's the vision of a strong, economically prosperous Ukraine on the border of the Russian Federation that Vladimir Putin fears most. Because of course, when his people, they keep very close tabs on what's happening in neighboring countries in Ukraine. When they see Ukraine begin to prosper, their people living better than the Russians will start to get agitated and start asking far more questions of the Kremlin and its authoritarianism than they have in the past 10 or 15 years. And things could unravel for Vladimir Putin and his cronies very, very quickly if that's happened. So that's, I think, the main fear in Vladimir Putin's mind, rather than this red herring that he goes on with about NATO membership. So I think a more detailed look and a more critical analysis of the NATO question for Ukraine is merited in Berlin and some other Western European capitals too.
Eoin McNamara, Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you very much.
And that's this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. Do stay with us. I'm Aaron Darman. Goodbye for now.